Hello, my name is Deborah Jarvis, and I'm going to be reading a passage from my book Wolves Running, and this is from chapter 15, The Rescue. It was midnight, and the snow had fallen for over 6 hours unabated. I lay in bed, half asleep, listening to the snow hissing against the house. John was sleeping next to me, a hand resting on my shoulder, dreaming deeply. Our love-making that evening had been slower, but with no less passion. We'd explored each other, leaving the lights on this time. Even after so short a time, John remembered things I liked and things I didn't. I had to learn him as well, and found out pretty fast what the limits of his experience really were. We took our time that long evening and had fallen asleep only an hour after sating ourselves. It was midnight, and it was snowing. I woke John, put on my bathrobe, and went downstairs. Disabling the security alarms, I put my robe regretfully on one of the hooks by the back door. The cold on my naked body was one of my least favorite parts. There's no better time than a storm to run in the city. We won't get lost, and the snow will fill in our tracks, I said. I'm going to leave this door unlocked. There's a fence that runs between us and the Twin Lakes Park behind us. It's about 6 feet high, and we can jump it with a running start. Change now. I'll follow. I went out and instantly shivered, but I closed the door firmly against the wind and changed. Fur cut the chill to my bones, but did nothing for the snow lashing at my eyes. I turned my nose away from the force of the storm and sniffed deeply, the cold, clean air filling my lungs. I led the way, jumping the fence with ease. John also cleared it with little effort, which made him turn and grin at me as if to say, "Ha! Did it!" Snorting, I darted to my right, and we engaged in a game of tag as we raced through the snow, John dodging, me darting, and the spray flying up behind us. We eventually turned to make our way back home, and were still intent in our game when a sound caught my ears. Nodding to John, I bounded towards our neighborhood and looked at the street from behind the screen of brush. Several police cars were parked across from our house, and the wind carried the distraught wails of a woman standing in the snow, pleading with the officers to find something. The man standing next to her was dressed for the weather and sounded desperate as he spoke to the policeman. It took me only a minute or so to understand what had happened. They had been watching TV and had thought their child was safe in bed. When they went upstairs to check on her, they found their little girl was not there. A frantic search of the house led to the discovery of an unlocked kitchen door, and the parents had gone hunting for her after calling the police. Their hunt had turned up nothing, and we were almost overpowered by the scent of their fear coupled with the fumes from the cars. I changed back to human, hunkering my body down against the trunk of a tree. "We need to find her," I said. John changed back as well and crouched next to me. "Shit," he muttered. "What can we do? Can we stay out here to search?" If the child was going anywhere, my guess would be the park. According to Google Earth, there's a path at the end of the cul-de-sac. She could have cut into the woods from there. That's where we'll head. Be careful not to be seen. Shifting back, my nose was assaulted by the smell of exhaust once more. I focused in on the parent's scent, registered it, and then caught and raced towards the woods, John at my heels. I thought I caught a faint whiff of something in the air that was similar to the parent's, though not exactly the same, but it was gone before I could pinpoint a direction. I whined at John, and we trotted through the hock-deep snow, peering through the wind-lashed curtains of swirling white. In the darkness ahead, we could see the officers' bright searchlights, and we swung out away from the voices of the police. I smelled a hint of the scent again and cast about, trying to follow it. John had angled further to the north than I, swerving towards the lake. I caught up to him just as he put a foot into the water, breaking the fragile ice. We looked at each other with alarm, hoping that the much lighter child hadn't stumbled onto it, had fallen through. We paced along the shore, peering through the snow to see if the edge of the water was broken anywhere, but nothing appeared to be amiss. I was getting more concerned, however. The girl had been out here for who knows how long at this point. It was cold, well below freezing, and she wouldn't last much longer. I worried that we would find a little frozen corpse instead of a child if we didn't find her soon. John picked up on my worry, and he cast about, nose to the wind, searching. As we made our way along, I suddenly caught a faint sound, almost like a bird song, high and tremulous. It was the fear in that cry. John's ears pricked up. He'd heard it too, and as we followed along the lake shore to the right, the sound came again, louder. The wind changed directions, and in the gust we caught the child's scent much more strongly than before. John altered his course abruptly, and I followed him into the brush along the shoreline. We found her huddled in some sort of evergreen, half frozen and terrified. It was the little girl, and when she saw us coming she began to cry even louder. With unspoken accord we huddled around her, sheltering her with our bodies. The snow on top of the bush and the two of us blocking the wind made the air in the little hollow warmer, and the child's crying was reduced to hitches and sobs as she curled up against my fur, shaking. John and I looked at each other. We had to get her home, fast. John moved behind me, hiding as best he could, and shifted back into human form. "What's your name, honey?" he said, peeking over at her. The little eyes went round as he spoke to her, and she whispered, "Sarah." "Okay, Sarah, we're going to take you home now," said John. "Climb on my back when I'm a wolf again, okay? We'll get you safe to Mommy and Daddy." She nodded and clung to me harder with her cold little hands. He changed back into his wolf form and crawled outside, staying crouched so she could climb aboard. I nosed her to leave the shelter and get on his back. Once she was on and had a firm grip of his ruff, John stood, and I steadied her as we walked through the storm back to the house. There was no help for it. We'd have to risk being seen. John moved as quickly as he could, and I tried to buffet the wind for them both, as much as I was able. She huddled against John, making no sound and hiding her face in his warm fur. We reached the trail again and headed for the break in the fence that led to our cul-de-sac, turning down the path towards the neighborhood. There was only one police car there now, with its lights on, and the child's mother could be seen through the windows of the house. John gritted his teeth and paced up the walkway to the porch steps. The little girl glanced up, and seeing her house, slid from John's back to run up the stairs. John backed up a few paces to where I waited, and we stood watch as she stretched up to ring the bell. The door opened, and with a cry of happiness the woman came out and swept her daughter up into her arms, hugging her and crying her name. Then she looked out and saw us, her breath catching in her throat. I nodded to her, and John cocked his head to one side. The child turned and said, "Mommy, Mommy, the doggies brought me back. The big one told me to ride on his back, and they brought me back home." Her mother glanced down at her daughter, then back at us. John bowed his head to her, and we turned to leave. "Wait," said the woman. She put the girl down, shooing her inside, and came back to the edge of the porch, staring at us where we'd paused on the walkway. "Thank you. Thank you for finding my baby. I'll let people know what you did for us, that you were good. Thank you so very much." John grinned a really goofy grin at that and wagged his tail, after which I head-butted him gently and we raced off into the snow as we heard the police returning from their searches down the trails. John and I headed towards the lake, ran a good mile to the right down the paths, and then turned and made our way back to our own yard. We leapt the fence again and raced up to the porch, where I changed back long enough to let us in and lock the door. John trotted upstairs. I reverted to wolf form and curled up on the couch in the living room to watch the action across the street. Moments later, John joined me, dressed in his sweatpants and sweatshirt. Not long after, an ambulance arrived. The little girl was probably okay. She'd had the presence of mind to put on shoes, at least. And when the ambulance left, no one went with it, so I guessed I was right. Finally, I had warmed up enough to become human and fetch my bathrobe. I put on the kettle, making a mental note to thank Kathy for adding it to the list, and found the box of cocoa that John had snuck into the carriage while we were shopping. While the water heated, I ran upstairs to find something warmer than just my bathrobe to wear. The kettle was whistling when I came back downstairs, and I made a cup of cocoa for myself and John before joining him. We stood looking out the window at the neighbor's house as the police finally left. The lights went out one by one in the houses along the street, but across from us, one little light still burned softly in an upstairs room. I would bet it was Sarah's room, and her parents were going to sit with her throughout the night. I knew I would have if she were mine. It was 3:00, and still snowing when John and I finally returned to bed. We curled up together for comfort, and slept, not caring when we woke the next morning.
We hope you enjoyed Wolves Running by Deborah Jarvis. Please check out the rest of the Indie Reading Library from Glasgow 2024 Presents.